one of the hardest things on this test will be actually drawing a graph from an equation from scratch, but it is something I want you to be able to do. So to be able to draw a graph, you first have to be able to identify all the characteristics from the equation. So first, the number in front is your amplitude. So right there, our amplitude is 5. Then the next is the midline. So in this case, our midline is 3. Now that lets you already start to draw the graph, or at least some characteristics. It lets you set up the y-axis of your graph. So the 3 has to be in the middle, and then you have to do a little mental math. From 3, we're going to go up 5, which means that'd put us at 8. And we're also going to go down 5, which would put us at -2. All right, you can label your y-axis then. That tells you where your x-axis is. But we can't fill that out quite yet, but you can then put the dashed line on the midline. Before you can do the x-axis, you have to figure out your period. So that comes from the b value, but the period is not 2. The 2 helps you find the period. So remember our equation, period is equal to 2 pi over b. We plug in the b value, which is 2. So in this case, the period is 2 pi over 2. That reduces, the period is just pi. So when we come to our graph, that's the first number I put on the x-axis, is pi. From there, we have to remember that a wave has 4 pieces to it, 4 parts. So we take that period and break it up into 4 pieces. I cut it in half once. Half of pi is pi over 2. Then I cut it in half again. So half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. And then that's the number you count by. So this is 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. That means this one is 3 pi over 4. This one is technically 4 pi over 4. Then you can just keep going. 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4. All right, once you have the x-axis labeled, the y-axis labeled, the midline drawn, it's time to start graphing the equation. This is a positive cosine that has no phase shift. So we start at the top, right here on the y-axis. All right, then we go over 1, and so we go from the top to the middle. Then we go over 1, we go from the middle to the bottom. And we just keep following that pattern. Bottom to the middle, middle to the top, top to the middle, middle to the bottom, etc., etc. All right, let's do one more. This time we're going to have a phase shift. All right, a little bit more tricky. But the beginning stays the same. You have to identify your amplitude. So this one will be 4. Identify your midline, the number at the end. Our midline is going to be -5. Then we can do our y-axis. -5 is the middle. From there, we're going to go up 4, which means we land at -1. We're going to go down 4, which means we land at -9. And if that's -1, 1 more up will be our x-axis. All right, midline, then of course you can put a dashed line at -5. Now our period. So we take the b value, pi. Again, that's not the period. It's going to help us find the period. We plug it into our formula. So our period is 2 pi over pi. Pi's cancel out. Our period is 2. So that's the first number I put on the x-axis. Again, a wave has 4 parts, so you take that 2 and cut it into 4 pieces. I cut it in half to get 1, and I cut it in half again to get a half. So I'm counting by 0.5s. So 0.5, 1. 3 halves is technically 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4. So those are all the sections of my wave. Now the phase shift. The phase shift is 3 to the right. So the first dot is going to go 3 to the right. Now I know that goes in the middle because this is sine. So it starts on the midline. And then I know from there, this graph has to go down because it is a negative sign. And then we just follow the pattern. So middle, bottom, middle, and I run out of room, so I have to go backwards. Middle, going backwards to the top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle. And you can go with that pattern as long as you want in either direction. All right, so that's one of the last skills you need is drawing a graph from an equation. So here are two for you to try. See if you can draw those graphs, pause the video, and draw a fairly accurate sketch of both of those using the amplitude, period, midline, and phase shift. Good luck.